A white cop spins a lie inside a hearing room, accusing a black woman with words sharp enough to ruin her life. But he has no idea who he's up against. Outside, the city is split in two, some shouting for the badge, others demanding justice for Naomi Reed. Every testimony, every scrap of evidence rips the mask off his authority until one shocking twist silences the room. Naomi isn't just a victim, she's a former Navy SEAL commander. From that moment, the hearing becomes a battlefield for justice, where one voice can turn an entire city upside down. The chamber of the Internal Affairs Disciplinary Committee wasn't a courthouse, but it might as well have been. Rows of wooden benches faced a long dais where 3 officials sat in dark suits, their expressions carved from stone. The place smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, but what hung heaviest in the air was tension. Cameras from the local news stations lined the back wall, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Reporters scribbled in notepads, ready to catch every word that might be uttered. Outside the tall windows, the muffled roar of demonstrators rose and fell like an angry tide. Naomi Reed sat at the table reserved for the accused, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly on the polished surface. To the casual onlooker, she looked unremarkable, a woman in her late 30s dressed simply in a navy blouse and black slacks. But those who studied her face more closely saw something else, a stillness that wasn't resignation but control. A quiet intensity that seemed out of place for someone under such heavy accusation. Her eyes, deep brown and steady, scanned the room without panic. Across from her sat Lieutenant Gregory Shaw, the man who had put her here. His police uniform was pressed to perfection, the brass buttons gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He leaned back in his chair, with the smug confidence of someone who believed the ground beneath him was solid stone. Every movement he made was for effect. The slow adjustment of his tie, the way he tapped 2 fingers against the table as if keeping time with an invisible drummer. When he finally rose to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. "My name is Lieutenant Gregory Shaw," he began, voice amplified by the microphone in front of him. "I have served this city honorably for 15 years. I am here today because on the evening of March 4th, I encountered this woman, Miss Reed, outside a closed hardware store at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was loitering, acting suspiciously. When I approached her, she immediately became hostile. She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to calm her, she struck me in the chest and reached for my firearm." Gasps spread through the chamber like ripples in water. Someone in the back whispered, "My God." Shaw paused just long enough to let the weight of his words settle, then leaned slightly forward, his voice dropping lower, more dramatic. At that moment, I had no choice but to restrain her. It was for my safety and for the safety of the community I swore to protect. The reporters scribbled faster. Camera flashes went off, bathing the room in harsh white light for an instant. The committee members exchanged glances, their brows furrowed. Outside the windows, the chants of the crowd grew louder, as if carried in by Shaw's words. Naomi sat utterly still, not a muscle moving, her face a calm mask that revealed nothing. "Lieutenant Shaw," one of the committee members asked, "you're saying Miss Reed assaulted you without provocation?" "That is correct," Shaw replied, his jaw tightening in mock solemnity. "I stand by my report." The man's confidence was like a performance, every phrase rehearsed, every gesture calculated. He spoke as though the story were undeniable, as though the truth belonged solely to him. For many in the room, it did. The sight of his uniform, the crisp salute he gave when asked to swear an oath, those things carried weight. And in contrast, Naomi looked like any other civilian, a woman who could easily be cast as unruly or defiant. Across the benches, heads turned, eyes narrowing toward her. Some looked pitying, others suspicious. A woman in the second row whispered to her neighbor, "Figures, always the same story." Her neighbor nodded, lips pressed tight. Naomi heard every word but gave no sign. Inside, her chest tightened, not with fear but with the familiar ache of recognition. She had seen this before, the quickness with which strangers could turn judgment into a verdict, how the color of her skin could weigh more than the truth of her actions. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment, breathing in deeply, steadying herself. The chairman of the committee leaned forward, his gavel tapping lightly for attention. "Miss Reed, you will have your chance to respond. For now, we will hear the remainder of Lieutenant Shaw's statement. Shaw continued, layering his testimony with small details, how her voice had been threatening, how her eyes had burned with aggression, how she had lunged toward him. Each word painted her as dangerous, unpredictable, the kind of person the public feared. By the time he finished, the mood in the chamber had shifted. Where there had been curiosity, there was now doubt. Where there had been uncertainty, suspicion now took root. Naomi finally opened her eyes. She felt every gaze pressing on her, like heavy stones laid upon her shoulders. But her spine remained straight, her chin lifted. She did not break eye contact with Shaw as he returned to his seat, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He leaned back again, hands folded over his stomach, the picture of self-satisfaction. The committee called a brief recess. Reporters rushed out to file their first stories, their voices buzzing with the thrill of scandal. On the benches, conversations erupted. "She went after his gun?" one man muttered, disbelief tinged with fear. Another shook his head. "They'll never let her walk free now." Naomi remained seated. Only her hands betrayed her thoughts, fingers pressing lightly against each other as if measuring out patience grain by grain. In the hum of voices and shuffling feet, she whispered to herself so quietly no one else could hear, "The truth will find its way." When the gavel struck again and the room quieted, the chairman announced, "We will reconvene shortly to hear Miss Reed's testimony. Until then, this session is in recess." As people filed past her, Naomi caught fragments of conversation. "She looks too calm for someone accused of assault. That's the problem. They always think they can get away with it. Words sharp as knives, words meant to wound without ever being spoken to her face." Naomi did not flinch. She sat there, still as stone, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the chamber walls, as if she were staring down an unseen horizon. Whatever storm Lieutenant Shaw thought he had unleashed, she was ready to weather it, because she knew something that no one else in that room yet understood. His lie might have started the fire, but the truth, her truth, was waiting, patient and unyielding, like a tide no man could hold back. By the time Naomi stepped out into the gray afternoon air, the world had already chosen sides. The courthouse steps, or rather, the broad stairs of the police administrative building where the committee hearings were being held, were a battlefield of voices and placards. On one side, men and women in blue t-shirts emblazoned with "Support Our Cops" pumped their fists and shouted chants that rolled like thunder. "Back the blue! Back the blue!" They waved American flags, some genuine in their patriotism, others brandished like shields of defiance. On the other side, a younger, more diverse crowd surged against metal barricades, their signs painted hastily with red and black strokes. "Justice for Naomi, no more lies, end police abuse." The two currents of outrage collided in the middle, separated only by a thin line of officers standing stiff-backed, their eyes hard beneath their helmets. The sound was deafening. Drums pounded somewhere, whistles shrieked, and the chant, "Justice! Justice!" cut through the noise like a blade. Naomi paused at the top of the stairs, a brief silhouette against the sky, and every camera in the crowd swung to capture her. The shouts rose higher, a storm of voices clashing in the open square. She didn't lift a hand, didn't wave or nod, only stood there with her back straight, the calm in her face so stark against the chaos that it unsettled even her own lawyer. Inside, reporters were already dashing off early headlines. "Officer claims assault by civilian. Black woman accused of attacking veteran cop." Talk radio hosts were speculating, fueling the fire before the hearing was even halfway through. Naomi's picture, her booking photo, cropped cruelly from the night she had been arrested, circulated across social media like a brand. People who had never seen her, never spoken to her, argued fiercely about who she was, what she had done, and what punishment she deserved. Jordan Ellis, clutching a stack of files too tightly, leaned toward Naomi and whispered, "Don't stop here too long. Every gesture you make will be twisted." Naomi's lips barely moved when she replied, "I'm not here to convince them with gestures." Her voice was steady, the tone of someone who had stood in worse storms and survived. Down among the protesters, an older man with a thick beard cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "She put her hands on an officer! Lock her up!" The words carried, picked up by the chants around him. But then, almost drowned beneath the din, A younger woman cried back, "We saw the video. She didn't fight him. He grabbed her first." A scuffle broke out, arms pushing, signs clashing together like swords, until the officers in the middle shoved the two sides apart again. Naomi stood still, but inside her chest there was a heaviness she didn't allow anyone to see. She had trained herself long ago to bear weight silently, to let her composure be a shield when the world pressed in. Yet it was impossible not to hear the venom in those voices, impossible not to feel how easily people wanted her defined by a single story told by a man in uniform. She wondered, not for the first time, how many others had been crushed by such stories, their truth buried under the sound of public judgment. A reporter broke through the cluster of cameras and shouted, "Miss Reed, are you prepared to testify tomorrow? Did you attack Lieutenant Shaw?" Microphones stretched toward her like grasping hands. Jordan stepped forward, ready to block, but Naomi shook her head faintly. She leaned toward the microphones and spoke only one sentence. "The truth doesn't need to shout. It stands on its own." Then she turned away, leaving the reporters scrambling, hungry for more, shouting questions that went unanswered. The committee's recess stretched into hours. In that time, the city seemed to split itself further down the middle. Local news ran live coverage of the protests, flashing clips of Naomi's quiet face alongside Shaw's decorated service photo. Callers flooded radio stations with heated opinions. Some claimed Naomi was a menace, others that Shaw was a liar hiding behind a badge. Families argued over dinner tables, neighbors over fences. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a wound being pulled open for everyone to gawk at. That evening, as dusk settled, the crowds outside lit candles. On one side, they were for the officers sacrificing their lives every day. On the other, they were for Naomi and every person who had felt the hand of power heavy on their back. Two seas of flickering light faced each other, flames swaying in the wind, each group believing theirs burned brighter. Naomi watched from a window above, Jordan beside her. Jordan's shoulders were tight, her breath uneven. "It's ugly," she murmured. "They don't even know the facts yet." Naomi's eyes stayed on the candles. People don't wait for facts. They cling to the story that feels safe, the one that fits the world they already believe in. Her tone carried no bitterness, only the weary knowledge of someone who had seen this pattern before. Jordan turned to her, her young face etched with worry. "How can you be so calm?" Naomi finally looked at her, a faint sadness behind her gaze. "Because panic won't change their minds. Only truth can. And the truth has patience, Jordan. It waits until the shouting tires itself out." Below, the chants swelled again, filling the night. The barricades rattled, the officers shifted nervously, and the cameras rolled on. Somewhere, a bottle shattered on the pavement, followed by a chorus of boos. The air smelled faintly of smoke now, the sharp tang of something burning nearby. Yet Naomi stood at the window, her silhouette steady, watching the divided city argue over her life. She knew then that tomorrow's testimony would not just be about her and Shaw. It would be about every voice outside, every candle, every chant. And she promised herself, as the crowd roared and the night deepened, that when her turn came, she would not simply defend her name. She would hold up a mirror to them all. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that promised rain even if it never delivered. By the time Naomi Reed was ushered back into the chamber, the benches were once again filled with spectators, reporters, and restless townsfolk. The cameras had multiplied overnight, long black lenses pointed at her every step. She walked with the same measured pace she always carried, shoulders back, head high, as if every eye on her was nothing more than a breeze brushing past. But deep inside, her heart beat a slow, deliberate rhythm, steady only because she forced it to be. The chairman tapped his gavel, the sharp crack pulling the room to silence. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you will now have the opportunity to give your testimony." She stood, smoothing the crease of her blouse with one hand. 1,000 eyes bore into her as she stepped toward the stand, the sound of her shoes against the wooden floor echoing far louder than it should have. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching across paper like insects at work. Naomi lowered herself into the chair, adjusted the microphone, and for a moment let the silence stretch, as if she were collecting not just her thoughts, but the courage to breathe them into existence. The prosecutor, a man with a hawk's nose and a voice sharpened by years of courtroom theater, leaned forward. "Miss Reed," he began, his tone dripping with a mixture of courtesy and disdain, "you understand that perjury is a crime, correct?" "Yes," Naomi said simply. "And you also understand that the statements made by Lieutenant Shaw yesterday were sworn under oath?" "I do." He gave a faint, knowing smile, then glanced at the jury of committee members. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why a decorated officer, a man with 15 years of service, would fabricate such a story. Why he would put his career, his honor, on the line unless he was telling the truth." Murmurs ran through the benches. Naomi's eyes remained on him, unblinking. "Because what he said was not true," she replied evenly. "And sometimes people lie to protect themselves." The prosecutor raised his brows, as though amused by her audacity. "That is a bold accusation, Miss Reed. Do you have proof?" Naomi's voice did not waver. "The truth doesn't need my permission to exist. It will reveal itself in time." A ripple of sound moved through the chamber again, hushed whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair. "How convenient." He let the words hang, then gestured toward her with a sweep of his hand. "Very well. Tell us what happened on the night of March 4th, in your own words." Naomi took a breath, the kind of breath that seemed to draw not just air but the weight of the room into her chest. She looked out across the chamber, her gaze passing briefly over the sea of skeptical faces before settling on the committee. "I was walking home," she began, her voice calm, "after visiting a friend. It was late, and I stopped on the sidewalk to check my phone for directions. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't disturbing anyone. I was just standing there under a street light, like anyone might." Shaw, seated a few feet away, shifted in his chair, his jaw tight. Naomi noticed it, but didn't flinch. "That's when Lieutenant Shaw approached me," she continued. "He shined his flashlight directly into my face and demanded to know what I was doing there. His tone was not polite. It was not cautious. It was hostile." The prosecutor's voice cut in quickly. "So you're saying you immediately questioned his authority?" Naomi turned her head slowly toward him. "No. I asked him a question. I asked if I had done something wrong because I knew I hadn't. That's not resisting. That's not hostile. That's asking for clarity, which I had every right to do." A woman in the back row gasped softly, and the chairman banged his gavel once. "Order." Naomi's gaze swept back to the committee. "When I asked that question, he raised his voice. He called me uncooperative. He told me people like me needed to learn how to listen." She paused there, letting the words sink in. A silence fell over the room, thicker than before, as though every person present had felt the sting of the phrase in their own skin. Shaw stiffened. His eyes darted nervously toward the reporters, then back to the table in front of him. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "That is a serious allegation, Miss Reed. Did anyone else hear this supposed remark?" "No," Naomi answered, her tone firm. "Because the body camera that should have recorded it was, according to Lieutenant Shaw, malfunctioning." A murmur spread again, louder this time, until the gavel cracked down. "Order in this chamber," the chairman barked. Naomi folded her hands in her lap, her composure unshaken. "I told him I wasn't causing trouble. I asked him to let go of my arm when he grabbed me. I did not raise my voice. I did not touch his weapon. I did not assault him. I only wanted to go home." The prosecutor leaned forward, his smile thinner now. "And yet you ended up in handcuffs." "Yes," Naomi said softly, though her eyes burned with quiet fire. "Because he decided that my existence in that place at that time was enough to justify force." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was so deep that the hum of the fluorescent lights could be heard, a faint buzz that seemed to underline the weight of her words. Then, slowly, the prosecutor straightened his papers, his tone colder. "We'll see what the committee believes. But let the record show, Miss Reed, that you offer no physical evidence, no corroborating witness, only your word." Naomi didn't look away. She held his gaze until he finally turned back to his notes. Then she shifted slightly in her chair, speaking clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. Sometimes one word is enough, if it's the truth. There was a stillness in the chamber, like the moment before a storm breaks. Reporters glanced at one another, sensing that something in her calmness was not ordinary, that there was more beneath the surface than what she had spoken. Shaw drummed his fingers nervously on the table, the rhythm betraying his discomfort. Naomi sat silently, her eyes steady, waiting for the storm she knew was coming. She hadn't revealed everything, far from it, but she had planted a seed, and the way it took root in the room was undeniable. For the first time since the hearings began, the weight of certainty seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if the truth had begun to stir in its sleep. When the committee recessed for lunch, the chamber buzzed like a restless hive. Reporters swarmed toward the exits, clutching recorders and notepads, already firing off headlines into their phones. Spectators clustered into little knots, whispering heatedly, their faces lit with indignation or doubt. Lieutenant Shaw slipped out a side door with his lawyer, his stride brisk, his chin lifted as though he were marching toward a victory he thought certain. Naomi, however, remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her lawyer, Jordan Ellis, bent toward her, voice low enough to be drowned by the noise. "You handled yourself well," Jordan said, though her tone betrayed nerves. "But they're not convinced. You can feel it." Naomi studied her, the young attorney with her sharp suit and trembling hands. She was barely 2 years out of law school, still wet behind the ears, her voice not yet seasoned with the kind of steel that comes from 100 courtroom battles. But there was something earnest in her eyes, a determination fighting through the fear. Naomi nodded once. "Convincing isn't the same as telling the truth," she murmured. "Let them wrestle with it." Jordan exhaled, fiddling with the strap of her leather bag. "We need more, something that tips the balance. Right now, it's your word against his, and everyone knows how that usually goes." The room was nearly empty when a voice piped up from near the doorway. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Both women turned. A boy no older than 15 lingered there, clutching a folded paper bag in one hand. His jeans were frayed at the knees, his baseball cap too large for his head. He glanced nervously around the chamber, as if afraid someone might chase him out, then shuffled closer. "Are you Miss Reed?" Naomi softened her expression. "I am. And you are?" "Derek," the boy said quickly. I deliver newspapers on the east side. That night I was biking my route. I saw what happened." His voice cracked, the weight of the words almost too much for him. Jordan straightened, her pulse quickening. "You saw the encounter?" Derek nodded vigorously. "I was across the street. I had my phone out. I think I recorded part of it." He pulled the device from his pocket, the cracked screen flickering as he thumbed through files. He held it out, and the grainy image came to life. The side of a patrol car, a dark street, and in the corner, the faint outline of Shaw's arm shoving Naomi against the hood. The audio was clearer than the picture. Shaw's voice, sharp and commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And Naomi's reply, firm but calm, "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." Jordan's hand flew to her mouth. The boy looked down, ashamed. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get in trouble with the cops. But when I saw the news this morning, it didn't sit right." Naomi reached out and gently closed his trembling fingers around the phone. "You were brave to come forward, Derek. Sometimes telling the truth is harder than carrying any weight." His eyes shone with relief. "Will it help you?" "It might," Jordan said, her mind already racing. "But we'll need to handle it carefully. Evidence like this has to be authenticated. The committee will try to dismiss it, say it's blurry, say it's taken out of context." Naomi placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and reassuring. "The truth has a way of speaking louder than their excuses." Derek nodded, shoulders sagging as though a burden had lifted. I wanted you to know you're not alone." Then he ducked his head and hurried out, the door closing softly behind him. Jordan sat heavily, running a hand over her face. "A kid on a bike may have just given us our lifeline," she whispered. She turned to Naomi, eyes searching. "Why do I feel like you expected something like this?" Naomi leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Because lies rarely hold forever. Someone always sees. Someone always remembers." Later, as the chamber filled again for the afternoon session, the atmosphere had shifted, if only slightly. Whispers rippled through the benches, rumors of new evidence, a mysterious witness. Shaw re-entered with his lawyer, but his smirk looked tighter now, stretched thin over nerves he couldn't quite hide. Naomi felt the air change, like the faint stir of wind before a storm. Jordan adjusted her files, her hands steadier than they'd been in the morning. She leaned close to Naomi and whispered, "If we can get that video admitted, even a fragment, it could unravel him." Naomi's eyes stayed fixed on Shaw as he took his seat. "The unraveling has already begun," she said softly. The gavel struck. The hearing resumed. And though no one in the chamber could yet name it, a shift had taken root, fragile but undeniable, born from the courage of a boy who refused to let the truth be buried. That evening, when the day's hearing finally adjourned, Naomi and Jordan left the building through a back exit to avoid the crush of cameras and shouts on the front steps. The city was painted in the fading glow of sunset, the sky streaked with burnt orange and deep violet. The roar of the crowd outside still carried, even though they were blocks away now, muffled but insistent, like waves hitting a distant shore. Naomi walked quietly, her pace steady, while Jordan clutched her briefcase with both hands as though it contained not only papers, but her entire sense of direction. They settled into a dimly lit diner a few streets over, one of those places with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The waitress brought them 2 mugs of coffee without asking, recognizing the exhaustion in their faces. Naomi wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. For a moment she was silent, her eyes fixed on the rising steam. Jordan shifted restlessly across from her, tapping her nails against the table, until finally she couldn't hold it in anymore. "Naomi," she said, leaning forward, her voice tight, "I need to know what else you're holding back. Today was strong, but it wasn't enough." They're still leaning toward him. You could feel it in the room. Naomi lifted her gaze slowly, her expression unreadable. "Patience, Jordan." The tide turned slow. "I don't have the luxury of patience," Jordan shot back. "I'm your attorney, and I'm standing in that room with nothing but your word against his. That boy's video helps, yes, but you saw how blurry it is. They'll tear it apart. If you've got something, anything, that could swing this, I need it now." Naomi's lips curved into a faint, almost weary smile. She took a sip of her coffee before answering. "You're young. You think truth works like lightning, sudden, blinding, but it's more like water carving through rock. It takes time." Jordan shook her head, frustration flickering in her eyes. "This isn't philosophy class. This is a hearing stacked against you. If you want me to defend you, you have to let me in. Who are you really, Naomi?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a knife. Naomi's gaze flicked to the window, where the neon sign from across the street blinked on and off. Her face softened just a fraction. "Come by my house tonight," she said quietly. "I'll show you." Jordan blinked, caught off guard. "Show me what?" "You'll know when you see it." Hours later, Jordan's car pulled up a narrow gravel driveway on the outskirts of town. Naomi's house was modest, tucked among tall oaks that swayed gently in the night breeze. A single porch light glowed, casting long shadows over the yard. Jordan killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the front door, nerves twisting in her stomach. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she knew it would change everything. Naomi opened the door before Jordan could knock, as if she had been waiting there all along. She wore a plain sweatshirt and dark leggings, her hair tied back. The composure that she carried in the chamber was still there, but in this softer light, it felt different, less armor, more essence. She gestured for Jordan to enter. The living room was sparse, neat but personal. On the mantel rested a folded American flag encased in glass. Next to it, a photograph of a younger Naomi in uniform, her arm around an older man whose face bore the same proud defiance. Bookshelves lined the wall, filled not with law or crime, but with histories of strategy, leadership, and resilience. Jordan's eyes lingered on the photo. "That's you," she murmured. Naomi nodded, moving to a small cabinet against the wall. She pulled out a leather-bound folder, edges worn but well kept, and set it on the table. She sat across from Jordan and slid it forward. "Everything you need to know is in here." Jordan hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were service records, commendations, training certificates, each page revealing a life that had been hidden in plain sight. Her breath caught as she scanned the words. United States Navy, SEAL Team, Lieutenant Commander? Her voice cracked with disbelief. She looked up sharply. "You were a Navy SEAL?" "Was," Naomi corrected softly. "I retired a few years ago." Jordan's hands trembled as she turned another page. "This changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before?" Naomi leaned back, her gaze steady but shadowed with something deeper. Because this case isn't just about me. If I walk in there and say, I'm a Navy SEAL, believe me, then it becomes about prestige, about who I was. But it's not. It's about what he represents, about a system that lets men like him twist lies into chains. Jordan's heart pounded, the enormity of it pressing down on her. But if the committee knew, if the public knew, they'll know when the time is right, Naomi interrupted gently. But not before. If I reveal it too soon, he'll adjust, they'll spin it. I need them to show their hand first. That's how you win battles, not by rushing in with everything, but by letting the enemy believe they're safe. Jordan sat back, overwhelmed. For the first time, she understood why Naomi had been so calm, so unshakable in the face of outrage. This was a woman who had stared down worse storms than this, who had carried secrets heavier than the judgment of strangers. Naomi reached for the folded flag on the mantel, holding it in her hands. I carried this through years of service, she said, her voice low. It reminds me that I fought for more than just orders. I fought for the idea that justice belongs to everyone, not just the ones with power. That's why I won't let him win. Not for me, but for everyone who's ever been told to stay silent. Jordan swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had never felt smaller and yet more determined in her life. So what's the plan? She whispered. Naomi's eyes lifted, steady as steel. Tomorrow, we keep playing it their way. We let them think the ground under them is solid, and then, when the time comes, we'll show them just how hollow it really is. For the first time, Jordan believed her. Sitting in that quiet house, surrounded by symbols of battles fought and survived, she understood that Naomi Reed was more than a client. She was a force, waiting for the right moment to strike, not with rage, but with truth, sharpened into a blade. Outside, the wind rustled through the oaks, carrying with it the faintest echo of the crowd's chants from the city. Jordan shivered, not from the cold, but from the sense that she was standing at the edge of something larger than herself. She looked at Naomi, who placed the flag gently back on the mantel, her fingers lingering on the glass case. You've been fighting your whole life, Jordan said softly. Naomi met her eyes, her expression fierce but calm. And tomorrow, she replied, is just another battle. The morning of the second hearing was overcast, the sky a dull sheet of pewter that pressed low over the city. Crowds had gathered early outside the police administrative building, their chants already echoing through the square. Inside, the chamber hummed with anticipation. The benches were filled to capacity, the air heavy with the musk of too many bodies and the crackle of expectation. Reporters whispered hurriedly into their phones, cameras clicking as people shuffled into place. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was theater, and every seat had sold out. Naomi walked in beside Jordan, the young lawyer's jaw tight with determination. The night before still lingered in Jordan's thoughts, the folded flag, the service records, the quiet power in Naomi's revelation. But none of that could be spoken here. For now, they had to play by the committee's rules. Jordan adjusted her files nervously, whispering under her breath as they moved toward the defense table. We need to be careful. If they smell desperation, they'll eat us alive. Naomi glanced at her, calm as ever. Then don't smell like desperation. Across the room, Lieutenant Shaw entered with his lawyer, his step slower than the day before. He wore the same crisp uniform, the brass polished to a gleam, but his posture had stiffened. His confident smirk flickered when his eyes met Naomi's. He looked away quickly, tugging at the edge of his sleeve as though the fabric itself had grown uncomfortable. The chairman's gavel came down, and the room stilled. We will continue with testimony. Lieutenant Shaw, please take the stand. Shaw rose, his movements precise, though his jaw clenched visibly as he walked to the front. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began his practiced script. As I stated yesterday, I encountered Miss Reed acting suspiciously outside a closed business. She refused to comply, became aggressive, and attempted to reach for my firearm. Jordan sat forward, pen in hand, eyes narrowing. The words were nearly identical to the previous day, each one rehearsed, each pause calculated. But something in his delivery was different this morning, less assured, thinner at the edges. Naomi caught it too. She watched the flicker in his eyes when he glanced at the committee, the stiffness in his shoulders as he forced his voice steady. When the prosecutor finished his line of questioning, the chairman turned. Defense may proceed. Jordan stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with one hand, the other gripping her notes. She walked to the stand, each step deliberate, her heels striking the floor with quiet precision. She stopped just a few feet from Shaw, close enough to read the tightening of his jaw, the twitch in his fingers. "Lieutenant Shaw," she began, her voice steady though a touch higher than she intended. "You testified yesterday that your body camera malfunctioned during this incident. Is that correct?" "Yes," Shaw replied, his tone clipped. "An unfortunate coincidence," Jordan said lightly. "How often has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest in your 15 years of service?" Shaw hesitated. The pause stretched too long. "Not often," he said finally. "But equipment can fail." Jordan tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Not often. Yet it failed during an arrest you claim was so volatile you feared for your life." Shaw shifted, his throat bobbing. "Yes." Jordan nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. Then she stepped closer to the jury box, her voice rising just enough to carry. "And is it also a coincidence, Lieutenant, that a citizen happened to record part of this encounter?" The chamber erupted in murmurs. Reporters sat up straighter, pens poised. Shaw's face tightened, his composure faltering. The chairman banged the gavel. "Order! Order in the chamber!" Jordan turned, walking back toward the defense table. She lifted a small USB drive between her fingers. "Your Honor, the defense submits video evidence recorded by a bystander on the night in question." Shaw's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is irregular. Sit down, counselor." The chairman cut him off, his voice sharp. "We'll view the footage." The bailiff took the drive, slid it into the courtroom's media system. The overhead screen flickered, shaky images filling the wall. The angle was poor, the picture grainy, but the audio rang clear. Shaw's voice thundered through the speakers. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then Naomi's voice followed, calm but firm. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." Gasps rippled across the benches. The footage showed Shaw's arm jerking, Naomi pressed against the hood of the car. His words cut like a blade. "Women like you don't get to question me." The chamber exploded. Reporters shouted questions. The crowd in the back row surged forward. The gavel cracked repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" the chairman roared, his face flushed with fury. Naomi sat still at the defense table, her hands folded neatly, her expression unchanged. But inside, she felt the shift, the sudden tremor in the wall of lies Shaw had built. Jordan leaned toward her, whispering fiercely, "This is it, Naomi. This is the crack." Naomi shook her head slightly, her eyes still fixed on Shaw, whose face had paled. "It's a start," she murmured. "Walls don't fall from one crack, but they fall all the same." Shaw fumbled for composure as the screen went dark. His lawyer sputtered. "The video doesn't show context. This is misleading." But his words rang hollow in the thick air of the chamber. People had heard enough. They had heard the tone in Shaw's voice, the cold arrogance, the disdain. They had heard Naomi's steadiness in contrast. The chairman leaned forward, his gaze heavy on Shaw. "Lieutenant, you will remain seated. This committee will reconvene after a short recess to consider this evidence." The gavel fell, but the noise did not subside. Reporters swarmed the aisles, the gallery buzzed with outrage and disbelief. Outside, the chants grew louder, echoing into the chamber through the thick glass windows. Naomi rose slowly, her posture deliberate, her calm presence cutting through the chaos. Shaw avoided her eyes, staring down at the table as though the grain of the wood might save him. Jordan gathered her papers with trembling hands, her face flushed with triumph and fear all at once. As they walked out together, Jordan whispered, "He's unraveling." Naomi's gaze never left the horizon. "Not yet," she said softly, "but the truth has started its work." When the committee reconvened that afternoon, the chamber carried a different weight than it had in the morning. The bystander's shaky video still lingered in everyone's minds, the sound of Shaw's words echoing in the silence even as the projector had gone dark. It wasn't proof enough to end the hearing, but it was proof enough to plant doubt. And doubt is a dangerous thing when it begins to spread through a crowd already restless. Naomi sat quietly, hands folded, her posture unshaken. Jordan sat beside her, flipping through papers with renewed urgency. Her pen tapped the desk, betraying nerves she couldn't quite suppress. She leaned toward Naomi and whispered, We can push harder now. That clip was just enough to open the door, but if we want to blow it wide, we need something bigger. Naomi's voice was calm, almost soothing. Then keep your eyes open. Bigger is never far away when men like Shaw leave a trail behind them. Almost as if summoned by those words, the door at the back of the chamber opened. A man slipped in, dressed plainly in a gray jacket, his press badge dangling from his neck. Marcus Lee, an investigative journalist known in certain circles for chasing corruption like a bloodhound, slid into an empty seat near the front. He carried a folder tucked under his arm, his eyes sharp and watchful. Jordan noticed him first. Her stomach flipped when he caught her gaze and gave the faintest nod, like a signal only she was meant to see. She scribbled a quick note, slid it toward Naomi. "Do you know him?" Naomi glanced at the note, then at Marcus. Her lips barely moved when she whispered, "No, but I know his kind." The prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie, his voice louder than necessary, as though trying to reclaim authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, the so-called video presented earlier is incomplete, grainy, and taken out of context. It is hardly reliable evidence. Let us not allow theatrics to obscure the truth of this matter. Lieutenant Shaw is a decorated officer with a spotless record." Marcus cleared his throat sharply. The sound cut through the room, drawing heads toward him. He stood, holding up the folder. "Spotless?" His voice was steady, but each syllable carried an edge. "I don't think so." The chairman frowned. "Sir, this is not a public forum. Identify yourself." "Marcus Lee, freelance journalist," he replied, flashing his badge. "And I have documents that this committee needs to see before you swallow any more of Shaw's rehearsed stories." Shaw stiffened in his seat, his lawyer half rising, his voice tense. "Objection! This man has no standing here." But the chairman raised his hand. The murmurs in the chamber swelled until the gavel struck 3 times. "Bring the documents forward." Marcus stepped down the aisle, his footsteps echoing. He laid the folder on the table before the committee, his gaze lingering on Shaw, who was suddenly very still. One of the officials opened the folder, eyes scanning the pages. His brows drew together, his lips pressing into a hard line. "These," Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying, "are internal complaints filed against Lieutenant Shaw over the past 10 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, improper conduct, each one dismissed or buried, some by his direct superiors, others simply ignored." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching furiously, cameras clicking like insects in a swarm. The committee members exchanged looks, some clearly unsettled. Shaw's lawyer barked, "This is irrelevant. Old grievances mean nothing." Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp. "Old grievances become patterns when they repeat themselves, counselor. Patterns that explain exactly how we ended up here today." Naomi sat in silence, her face calm, but inside she felt the current shift again. This was what she had been waiting for, not a thunderbolt, but a crack widening, stone beginning to give way beneath the weight of truth. Jordan's heart pounded beside her. She leaned in, whispering so low only Naomi could hear, "This is it. This could sink him." Naomi's reply was quiet, steady. "Not yet, but it will." Shaw finally spoke, his voice louder than necessary, trembling at the edges. "Those complaints were baseless, made by criminals and liars who wanted to get back at me for doing my job. None of them held water. That's why they were dismissed." But his words sounded brittle, defensive. The committee member holding the folder looked up, his eyes narrowed, or perhaps dismissed because someone wanted them to disappear. The tension in the chamber grew heavy, pressing down on everyone present. Reporters leaned forward, desperate to catch each word. The audience's murmurs rose again, carrying with them an undercurrent of anger. The uniform that had once wrapped Shaw in authority now felt like a costume unraveling thread by thread. Naomi's gaze met Shaw's across the room. For the first time, his eyes faltered, unable to hold hers. He looked away, his jaw clenched, his hand trembling slightly on the edge of the table. Jordan whispered again, excitement in her voice. "He's slipping. They see it now." Naomi's eyes stayed fixed, unyielding. "Slipping men claw harder. Let him. The harder he claws, the deeper the truth will cut." The gavel struck once more. The chairman's voice was steady but grim. "This committee will review these documents in detail. Until then, we will proceed with testimony." He paused, his gaze flicking briefly toward Shaw. "But know this. Spotless records do not survive scrutiny if they were never truly clean. The hearing resumed, but the air had shifted. Shaw sat stiff and silent, his confidence eroded, while Naomi remained calm, her composure a quiet storm gathering strength. Marcus returned to his seat, folding his arms, his expression unreadable, but his presence undeniable. For the first time, the chamber no longer felt like Shaw's stage. The spotlight had moved, and it illuminated shadows he had hoped would never see the light of day. And as Naomi sat in stillness, her eyes steady, she knew the battle was far from over. But the cracks in the wall were spreading, and the fall had already begun. The chamber felt swollen with unease when the hearing resumed the next morning. The journalists had multiplied, squeezing into every spare inch of bench and wall, their cameras primed like rifles waiting for the first shot. Outside, the crowd had doubled overnight, their chants bleeding faintly through the windows, a reminder that this was no longer confined to the panel of officials. The city was watching, the country beginning to listen. Naomi entered the room in a navy blazer and crisp white blouse, her stride measured, her face calm. To the casual eye, she seemed like any defendant summoned to face judgment. But those who looked closer sensed something else beneath the quiet, like the low hum of an engine waiting to roar. Lieutenant Shaw sat at the plaintiff's table, his uniform as polished as ever, but his skin carried a pale sheen. His eyes darted toward the folder Marcus Lee had submitted the day before, now sitting ominously on the committee's table. He straightened his tie for the fourth time in as many minutes. His smirk was gone. The chairman struck the gavel. "We will continue with the case of State versus Naomi Reed. Mr. Ellis, the defense may call its witness." Jordan stood, papers trembling only slightly in her hand. She cleared her throat, drawing strength from the quiet nod Naomi gave her. "Your Honor, the defense calls Naomi Reed to the stand." The room stirred. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Naomi rose slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked to the witness chair. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore her oath, then sat tall, her back straight as a steel rod. The weight of the room seemed to condense around her. Jordan approached, her voice steady but gentle. "Miss Reed, you've heard the accusations. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Are any of these true?" "No," Naomi said, her voice carrying evenly across the chamber. "Then tell us, in your own words, what really happened that night." Naomi drew in a breath, her eyes sweeping the room before settling on the committee. "I was walking home after visiting a friend. I stopped on the sidewalk to check my phone for directions. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't disturbing anyone. I was just standing there, under a streetlight, like anyone might. That's when Lieutenant Shaw approached me, flashlight in my face. He demanded to know what I was doing there, as though standing on a public street was a crime." Her words dropped like stones into the silence. Shaw shifted, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Naomi continued, her tone steady. "When I asked if I had done anything wrong, he raised his voice. He called me uncooperative. He grabbed my arm. I told him I wasn't resisting, that I wanted to go home. He didn't let go. He slammed me against his patrol car. Then he accused me of reaching for his weapon. That never happened." Gasps broke across the benches, the echoes of disbelief mixing with anger. The chairman struck the gavel. "Order!" Jordan let the silence linger, then spoke softly. "There's been speculation about your background, Miss Reed. The prosecution has painted you as an ordinary civilian who suddenly turned violent. Is there more the court should know about you?" Naomi's eyes locked onto Jordan's for a heartbeat, then moved to the committee, then to the gallery, and finally to Shaw. For the first time, her calmness cracked, not into fear, but into something fiercer. Resolve, strength. Anger held carefully in check. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, ringing clear. "There is more." She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the wooden railing of the stand. "I am Lieutenant Commander Naomi Reed, retired Navy SEAL. I served my country for 18 years in some of the most dangerous places in the world. I led men into battle, saved lives, and buried comrades. I have faced enemies armed to the teeth, and I did not break. And now I sit here accused of attacking a man who thought my existence was suspicious." The chamber exploded. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed so wildly, the room looked like a storm of lightning. The gallery gasped, some voices crying out in shock, others in awe. Even the committee members froze, their pens poised midair. Shaw's face drained of color. His jaw worked, but no words came. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The chairman hammered the gavel, his voice thundering. Order! I will have order in this chamber. The noise ebbed slowly, but the air was thick, charged with revelation. Jordan stepped forward, her voice rising with quiet confidence. Commander Reed, as a Navy SEAL, you were trained to handle high-pressure situations. Did you use any of that training during your encounter with Lieutenant Shaw? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes, I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate, to protect myself without violence. My training taught me that restraint is sometimes stronger than force. I did not resist. I did not reach for his weapon. I refused to let him strip me of my dignity. The words sank deep. For a moment, even the gavel seemed unnecessary. The chamber was too stunned to breathe. Shaw shifted again, but the movement looked desperate, defensive. Jordan turned to the jury of committee members. You've heard Lieutenant Shaw's story, and now you've heard the truth from a woman who has spent her life defending this country. The question before you is simple. Who do you believe? Naomi held her head high as she stepped down from the stand, the weight of her revelation lingering in the room like smoke after a gunshot. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief, but of reckoning. Shaw sat rigid, his once confident presence unraveling as the truth he had not prepared for carved its way into the open. The hearing was far from over, but the ground had shifted. For the first time, the crowd inside and outside the chamber saw Naomi not as a woman accused, but as a soldier returned, standing once more on the battlefield. Only this time, the war was for justice. The air in the chamber was still trembling from Naomi's revelation. It was the kind of moment that didn't just shift the course of a hearing, it split it wide open. People sat stunned, their whispers not yet catching up to what they just heard. Outside, though no one inside could see it, the crowd had erupted, chants of her name mixing with cries for justice. Cameras flashed without rhythm, the light stuttering across Naomi's calm face like bursts of lightning. Lieutenant Shaw sat stiff at the plaintiff's table, his skin clammy, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. The uniform he wore, once polished into a symbol of authority, now looked too heavy for him, the collar choking rather than commanding. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, his lips a thin line. He wiped his palms against his thighs under the table, a movement small but noticed by the hungry eyes of reporters. The chairman struck the gavel sharply. "This committee will restore order," he barked. But his voice lacked the certainty it had before. Even he had been rattled by Naomi's announcement. His eyes lingered on her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Jordan leaned closer to Naomi at the defense table. "You just took the roof off the place," she whispered, still catching her breath. "He doesn't know how to come back from that." Naomi's gaze never left Shaw. Men like him always try. Watch closely. His fight isn't over, but neither is mine. The prosecutor scrambled to his feet, his tie askew, his voice louder than before, as though volume might rebuild what had been torn down. "This is irrelevant. This is a smokescreen. Military service does not excuse criminal behavior. We cannot let theatrics distract from the facts. The defendant assaulted an officer." His words spilled out too quickly, too rehearsed, and the audience was no longer leaning toward him. They were watching Shaw, whose mask was slipping by the second. Shaw shot up suddenly, unable to contain himself. His chair screeched across the floor, the sound grating through the chamber. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice raw. "All of it. Lies. She's not the hero you think she is." The outburst froze the room. Cameras swiveled instantly, snapping the sweat on his forehead, the red in his cheeks. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering furiously, but Shaw shook him off. He jabbed a finger toward Naomi. "You think because she wore a uniform once, that makes her untouchable? She was nothing but trouble from the start. She looked at me with defiance, like she thought she was better than the law. I did what I had to do." The words tumbled out harsher than he intended, his voice cracking under the weight of his own anger. Murmurs swelled across the gallery. Jordan leaned back slightly, eyes wide, whispering, "He's unraveling." Naomi remained composed, her chin high, her eyes steady on him. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried further than his shouts. No, Lieutenant. You did what you thought you could get away with. The contrast hit like a hammer. Shaw's anger looked feral beside Naomi's restraint. The committee members exchanged uneasy glances, one of them scribbling furiously in the margin of his notes. The chairman pounded the gavel again. Lieutenant Shaw, you will restrain yourself. But Shaw wasn't finished. His voice rose louder, cracking in desperation. She's twisting this. She was hostile, uncooperative. People like her. He stopped abruptly, realizing too late what he'd almost said. His lawyer buried his face in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. People like me? The words hovered in the air, demanding an answer Shaw couldn't give. His mouth opened, then closed, his face blotched with shame and fury. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing they'd just captured the headline of the day. The chairman's voice thundered again, though his authority rang hollow. This hearing will recess until order can be restored. The gavel struck, but the tension didn't break. The crowd in the gallery surged with murmurs, some shaking their heads, others whispering to one another with wide eyes. Shaw sank back into his chair, his uniform soaked through with sweat, his chest rising and falling too fast. His fellow officers, seated in silent rows at the back, shifted uneasily, some looking away from him altogether. Jordan turned to Naomi, her voice hushed but electric. He just exposed himself. They saw it. They heard it. The cracks are wide now. Naomi looked at Shaw one last time, her face unreadable, but her voice carrying the certainty of a woman who had seen battles through to their end. Cracks become collapse, Jordan. You just have to let gravity do the work. As they rose from their seats, the chamber buzzed like a hive disturbed, reporters pushing toward the aisles, officials whispering urgently to one another. Outside, the chants grew louder, echoing through the thick stone walls. Justice for Naomi! Justice for Naomi! For the first time, Lieutenant Gregory Shaw looked less like an officer of the law and more like a man cornered by his own shadow. And for the first time, the city could smell the fear rising off him. By the time the committee reconvened, the chamber had transformed from a place of measured testimony into something rawer, closer to a battlefield. The energy was restless, heavy with expectation, every seat filled and every eye trained on the two figures at the center of it all. Lieutenant Shaw sat slouched at the plaintiff's table, his face pallid, his uniform damp beneath the lights. Across from him, Naomi Reed sat as if carved from stone, her composure untouched by the storm swirling around them. Jordan sat beside her, papers neatly stacked but hands clenched tight in her lap, fighting the tremor that came from knowing they were at the edge of a decisive moment. The chairman's gavel struck sharply. This committee will resume. We will continue with cross-examination. His eyes swept the room, pausing on Shaw with unmistakable severity. Lieutenant, compose yourself. This chamber will not tolerate further outbursts. Shaw's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering fiercely, but Shaw barely nodded, his jaw clenched, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. He looked smaller now, stripped of the arrogance that once buoyed him, but there was still a spark of stubborn defiance smoldering in him, the kind that makes a drowning man kick harder as the water closes over his head. Jordan rose, smoothing the skirt of her suit, and walked deliberately toward the stand. Each step echoed in the chamber, louder than the murmur of the crowd. She stopped just short of Shaw, fixing him with a gaze steadier than she felt inside. Lieutenant Shaw, she began, her voice measured, you testified that my client attempted to reach for your weapon. Is that correct? Yes, Shaw said, his voice rough but firm. Jordan nodded slightly, her tone sharpening. And yet, despite such a serious allegation, there were no fingerprints, no evidence of her hand on your holster, no corroborating testimony from fellow officers. Just your word. Shaw's jaw tightened. I know what I saw. You know what you claim you saw, Jordan countered smoothly. She turned toward the committee, her voice rising just enough. But what this committee has seen is a video of Lieutenant Shaw pressing Miss Reed against his patrol car. What they've heard is his voice saying, women like you don't get to question me. That's not an officer describing a threat. That's a man asserting power. The chamber stirred, whispers rising like a tide. Shaw's lawyer objected, but the chairman waved him down. Jordan pressed forward. Lieutenant, do you expect this committee to believe that a woman with 18 years of Navy SEAL training, A lieutenant commander who has led men into combat chose that moment on a quiet city street to suddenly attack you without provocation? Shaw hesitated, his mouth working, but no words came quickly enough. His silence stretched, and in it the weight of doubt pressed harder on the room. Marcus Lee, seated near the front, leaned forward, scribbling notes, his sharp eyes never leaving Shaw. From the back, Derek, the young paperboy witness, fidgeted nervously, glancing at Naomi with a mixture of awe and hope. Finally, Shaw found his voice, though it cracked at the edges. She was hostile. She was defiant. She challenged my authority. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Is that what this is about, Lieutenant? Authority? That a woman standing on a sidewalk asked you why you needed her ID? That she didn't bow to your demand quickly enough? Is that why you escalated the situation? Shaw's face flushed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. She refused to comply. I had to maintain control. Control, Jordan repeated softly, letting the word linger. She turned to the committee again, her voice firm. Not safety, not de-escalation, control. That is what this has been about from the very beginning. The murmurs swelled again, reporters scribbling furiously. Shaw's breathing quickened, his eyes darting, searching for an anchor he no longer had. His lawyer tried again to interject, but the chairman silenced him with a stern glare. Jordan stepped closer, her voice dropping low but cutting like glass. Lieutenant, you accused a decorated veteran, a woman who has risked her life for this country, of being a threat to you. You lied under oath to protect yourself. You thought your badge would shield you, but it can't. Not anymore. Shaw opened his mouth, but nothing came. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands trembling as he gripped the table. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Naomi sat still, her eyes fixed on Shaw. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply watched him, as one might watch a structure collapse in slow motion. When she finally spoke, it was not loud, but every syllable reached the far corners of the chamber. Lieutenant Shaw, you didn't just underestimate me. You underestimated the truth, and the truth doesn't need a badge to make it strong. Her words were heavy now, pressing into every heart in the room. Jordan sat motionless, her throat tight, tears stinging the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Marcus Lee scribbled furiously, but even he paused to look up, knowing this was not just testimony, but history unfolding. Naomi let the silence stretch once more, then closed with words that cut as cleanly as a blade. I faced enemies who carried guns and rockets, men who would have killed me without hesitation. But I never thought I'd face an enemy here, on the streets of my own country, wearing the same flag I once defended. That is a wound deeper than any battlefield could give me. And that's why I stand here, not broken, not ashamed, but unshaken. Because dignity is something no one can take unless we let them, and I don't intend to let anyone take mine. When she finished, the room didn't erupt as it had before. There was no chaos, no wild shouting. Instead, a hushed awe filled the chamber, the kind that sinks into bones. Some of the spectators bowed their heads, others wiped at their eyes discreetly. Even the chairman's stern mask cracked, his lips pressing together as if to hold back what he could not admit aloud. Naomi walked back to her seat, her steps just as steady as when she had risen. Jordan reached out, touching her arm lightly, her voice breaking into a whisper. You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for all of us. Naomi lowered herself into the chair, her hands folding once more. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply sat, waiting. The weight of what had been said hung in the air, impossible to ignore. And across the room, Shaw slumped further in his chair, his face turned away, his once bright uniform now nothing more than fabric wrapped around a man who had already lost far more than the case. The final morning broke clear, the sky washed in a pale blue that seemed almost mocking in its calmness. Outside the police administrative building, the crowd had grown into a sea, spilling into nearby streets, their chants carrying like waves against stone. Reporters stood on boxes to get better shots, their microphones and cameras aimed at the entrance. The city was waiting, bracing for the words that would decide not just Naomi's fate, but perhaps something larger, something that had been festering in the air long before this case ever began. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. The benches were filled with spectators, many of whom had stood in line since dawn. The committee members sat with grave expressions, the weight of their deliberations etched in their faces. Shaw sat at the plaintiff's table, but he looked like a man hollowed out. His shoulders slumped, his eyes bloodshot, his hands clenched into fists that trembled against the wood. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Shaw didn't seem to hear. He stared at nothing, his jaw set in a defiance that had curdled into desperation. Naomi sat across the room, her posture calm, her gaze steady. Jordan leaned beside her, clutching her briefcase like a lifeline, her lips moving in a silent prayer she didn't dare speak aloud. Marcus Lee sat in the front row, pen poised but unmoving, knowing instinctively that whatever came next needed no embellishment, only truth. Derek, the young paperboy, sat further back, twisting his cap in his hands, his wide eyes fixed on Naomi, as though his belief alone might tip the scales. The gavel struck once, sharp and echoing. The chairman's voice carried, solemn but clear. This committee has reached its decision. The chamber stilled. Reporters froze, pens hovering, cameras clicking softly. Naomi felt the silence settle deep in her chest, but her breath remained even, her face as unreadable as stone. The chairman unfolded a paper, his eyes scanning the lines before he spoke. On the charges of resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and attempting to seize a weapon, this committee finds the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Naomi Reed, not guilty. The words cracked through the silence like thunder. Gasps rose, then murmurs, then cheers erupting from the gallery until the gavel slammed again. "Order!" the chairman barked, but even he couldn't completely erase the swell of relief and joy that swept the room. Jordan exhaled sharply, pressing a hand over her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Naomi closed her own briefly, the faintest flicker of release crossing her features before she opened them again, gaze steady as ever. The chairman's voice continued, weighty with finality. Furthermore, this committee strongly recommends an independent investigation into the conduct of Lieutenant Gregory Shaw. Allegations of misconduct, racial bias, and excessive force shall be reviewed in full. This matter is far from closed. All eyes turned toward Shaw. His face had drained of color, his lips moving silently as if searching for words that wouldn't come. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, but Shaw shoved him off, slamming a fist against the table. "This isn't over," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. His words, once heavy with authority, now fell flat, bouncing off walls that no longer echoed for him. Naomi rose slowly, her movements measured. Reporters surged toward the aisle, their questions overlapping, but the bailiff held them back. She walked with Jordan by her side, the steady hum of applause and cheers following her every step. Shaw sank further into his chair, shrinking as she passed, unable to meet her gaze. Outside, the crowd roared the moment Naomi appeared on the courthouse steps. Chants of her name rose with the swell of voices. "Naomi! Naomi! Justice for Naomi!" Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones thrust forward, but Naomi didn't flinch. She stopped at the top of the steps. Jordan at her side, Marcus and Derek not far behind. She looked out over the sea of faces, 1,000 eyes reflecting both rage and hope. When she spoke, her voice cut through the roar, clear and unwavering. "This isn't just my victory. This is a victory for every person who's been told their voice doesn't matter, for everyone who has been silenced, profiled, or pushed aside by those who swore to protect them. The truth fought its way here today, and it won. Not because of me alone, but because people stood up, because evidence was brought forward, because silence was broken." The crowd cheered louder, but Naomi lifted her hand slightly, and the noise softened enough for her to continue. "I wore this country's uniform for 18 years. I fought battles overseas, but today we fought one here at home. Justice doesn't belong to uniforms or badges. It belongs to people, and if we want it to survive, we have to keep demanding it." Her words hung in the air, carried on the wind that swept over the crowd. Jordan stood beside her, shoulders trembling with pride. Marcus scribbled furiously, though his eyes stayed on Naomi, knowing this speech would become the lead in every story he'd write for years. Derek clutched his cap, his small voice joining the chant rising once more. "Justice! Justice!" Naomi stepped down the stairs slowly, the crowd parting like a tide as she passed. She didn't smile broadly or wave triumphantly. Instead, She walked with the dignity of someone who had carried herself through fire and emerged intact. She knew the fight wasn't over. Shaw would face his own reckoning, and the system that had protected him for years would be forced into the light. But in this moment, she had done what she came to do. That night, when the streets finally quieted and the city exhaled, Naomi stood alone in her modest living room. The folded flag on the mantel caught the dim glow of the lamp. She picked it up, holding it in her hands, her fingers brushing the fabric with reverence. For a long moment she simply stood there, the silence wrapping around her like a blanket. Then she whispered softly, not for cameras, not for crowds, but for herself. Another battle fought, another battle won. She set the flag back gently, her hand lingering on the glass case. The world outside might roar with headlines, debates, and arguments. But here, in the quiet of her home, Naomi Reed, lieutenant commander, veteran, survivor, and now a symbol of justice, let herself breathe. For tomorrow would bring another fight, but tonight the truth had prevailed. And that, for once, was enough.